Hearing for February 10th, 2025. Our first thing on the agenda is a Pledge of Allegiance. If you'd please stand and join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Next, I'll look for approval of tonight's agenda.
So moved.
Support.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, it's passed. And we move on to the next item, which is declaration of conflict of interest. If there's any of the commission members that have a conflict of any of the hearings, which is one hearing tonight, please say so at this time. Hearing none, I'll open the first call to the public for items that are not on tonight's agenda. Please step forward if you're... Please state your name, your address, your social security number.
Yes, Jeff D. Hanens, 5494 Sharp Drive, Howell. Just a reminder, I know that you are looking at an item today which talks about drive-throughs and changing some of the zoning, and then I had put in a request for looking at food trucks. I know there's also the potential of opening up the master plan. The current master plan we adopted in 2023 has 3 references to those same food trucks and temporary pop-ups. So I just hope in the future it's coming soon. And I hear it is, but I just wanted to have on the record that I'm looking forward to hearing about that opportunity in the community. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else? Seeing none, I'll close the call to the public and start our first open public hearing. Discussion of an ordinance amendment to Article 7, Commercial and Service Districts in regards to drive-through restaurants. Who's handling all this? Mr. Bryan, or?
I'll start, Mr. Chair.
You go.
Am I good on the mics, or should I?
You might want to turn
We
it
are
on.
on TV, right? All right.
Is it turned on?
I don't know.
Tap it.
Let's go towards you. There you go.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can everybody hear me? I couldn't resist. All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate the time. We initiated a quick dialogue towards the end of last month's meeting, bringing up this idea of making some changes to commercial zone districts and some other items that were specifically tied to drive-through restaurants. So in the time since last meeting, we put together the draft that's in front of you tonight. This is only up for discussion tonight, so no public hearing, no action, simply discussion, and we want to get your input and then make changes as needed with the hopes that we can move this forward to public hearing at next month's meeting so that we don't have to belabor this. But if more time's needed, more time's needed. So, we're not going to push for anything that you guys aren't ready for. But, Mr. Chair, what I'd like to do is maybe just take a quick walk through what we've put together for you, and then we can jump into questions, answers, comments, suggestions, etc. So the first thing that we did, as we had discussed last month, was to simply add drive-through restaurants as an allowable use via special land use approval in the general commercial district GCD. Currently, that's only an allowable use as a special land use in the RCD. So we are expanding where you could potentially pursue a drive-through restaurant. So that was the first thing we had to do, and you'll see the very first part of this draft. All that takes is adding an S to the table for drive-through restaurants under the RCD column. So pretty straightforward. I will add that we had discussed the idea of maybe merging this and eliminating a couple of the other categories, but what I did find when I looked deeper into the ordinance, specifically we had talked about getting rid of coffee shop with drive-through and just calling everything a drive-through restaurant because they're all food service. But your ordinance actually does have a definition for a drive-through coffee shop. So I didn't want to mess with that. So I figured we do have a definition. We do have parking standards that are a little different than the restaurant. So I thought it was generally a good idea just to keep that in place. But I know we had talked about that, so I wanted to make sure I brought that up tonight specifically, because I think, Eric, we had specifically had that conversation of these distinctions of categories. Why not make it easier, simplify it? I think the fact that the ordinance sort of covers it already in an all-encompassing manner, I felt comfortable just leaving it in. So that's why we did that. The next section is related to the use conditions that would apply, or actually do currently apply, and as amended, would still apply to drive-through restaurants. Now, it's important to note, these same conditions also apply to drive-in restaurants as well as drive-through coffee shops. So the way the table currently sets up, these use conditions apply to multiple uses, including the drive-through restaurants. So the tweaks that we made here, some of it's just cleanup. So if you're looking at paragraph J under 70202, I'll just go paragraph by paragraph. So item 1, this was just a cleanup. We just added, instead of shall be set back 50 feet, we inserted a minimum of. It's pretty straightforward. I think it's a little cleaner that way. Item 2, this is another one we wanted to talk about, because the dialogue we had last month was the idea of just getting rid of the 500-foot spacing between drive-throughs. And when staff and I talked about taking it out, we did identify some concerns about just removing it. And so what we've tried to do was expand upon that and provide some opportunities for use of discretion. So in certain instances, Planning Commission would have the ability to waive that 500-foot spacing, and we felt like that was a little bit better protection. Part of the concern really was, by adding this use to the GCD district, we are really opening up this to a lot more land area. A lot more properties could potentially be converted and or developed as drive-through restaurants. They still have to go through special land use, they still have to go through site plan, but as far as the opportunity, we're really expanding where that can happen. A lot of that's on Grand River. A lot of these sites are already developed. So there is a little bit of a concern of having a setup where we get drive-through next to drive-through next to drive-through next to drive-through, and all of that traffic enters and exits from Grand River, generally speaking, and then the potential of what that does to the public roadway. So the idea here was we would keep the 500-foot spacing, but provide certain caveats where commission, as part of special use and site plan, could waive that requirement. What we came up with, let me sort of rephrase, the caveats that we wanted to come up with were for uses that we felt would not negatively impact the public right of way. So the idea here was we added, if the property accesses an internal service drive, so it doesn't directly go onto Grand River, but actually we have a number of shopping centers and outlot areas where the direct access isn't to and from the main roadway. It's actually to a separate internal driveway, and then you access at a different point where multiple businesses access the public roadway. So we felt like that wouldn't necessarily disrupt the roadway. Same thing with a signalized intersection. So if a driveway is exiting at a signalized intersection, that's controlling the traffic flow already. So we weren't as concerned about vehicles potentially impacting the right-of-way there either. And then the last one we came up with was the idea of just a use that isn't as intense as maybe some of the others. And I will tell you that the number we came up with was really intended just as kind of a placeholder for discussion. So what we came up with was, if a use is going to generate 50 or fewer trips in AM, PM, peak hour, that would be another rationale that the commission could use to not require the 500-foot spacing between drive-throughs. Whether that 50 is the right number or not, I don't know right now, but I wanted to put it in there for discussion. So I think there's room for some dialogue with you all tonight. I will add that I was able to talk to Shelby a little bit before the meeting, and she thought right off the bat that if 50 is the number, if we insert into that sentence 50 directional trips, that would potentially be an improvement, because what that would do is, I think that's how much of the traffic study stuff is already based. And then 50 directional trips still is not significant traffic volume, but that would be 50 trips entering or 50 trips exiting, whereas the way I drafted it, 50 or fewer trips would technically mean both. So if it was 25 entering and 25 exiting, that's the 50 trips. So I feel like 50 directional trips gives actually a little more leeway without going too far, because I don't think that that's still a significant amount of traffic. I think your traffic study starts at 100 directional, or 100 trips peak hour, directional trips peak hour. So this would be half of something that would trigger the need for a traffic study. So that was something I thought was a really good idea, and that's something that I would definitely propose. If we're good on the 50, I would say let's change that to 50 directional trips or fewer. in
Brian,
this
can I ask a
instance.
question really
Please.
quick, just so I understand? So directional essentially asserts that direction in or out.
Correct. It would be
Okay.
one of the directions.
Okay.
So if, and actually maybe we need to tweak that again, because what if one, I don't know, I'm going to need Shelby's input on some of this, but I'm trying to think how this would work. If there's more than 50 ingress, but less than 50 egress, then,
That would be more than, right?
yeah, then it would still, so maybe it needs to be, yeah. I just want to make sure that it's written clearly. If either of those, if either directional trip exceeds 50, you don't qualify for that waiver. So I think we may have to,
In the
we may have to
wording.
massage this a little
Yes,
bit more.
okay,
But I think that's the general intent, at least,
Okay.
that I want to put out there.
thank you.
Yeah, I also have a question, sorry. In number 2, you've struck the word restaurant. So it reads, "The establishment of a new drive-through excluding a drive-in
Yes.
shall require." So we're just, a drive-through there implies it's a drive-through restaurant.
So the intent there was, right now, it explicitly says restaurant, which would mean technically, if so, and I don't think that's the intent, but technically, if somebody wanted to say coffee shop next to restaurant, then the 500-foot would not apply currently. And I don't think that's the intent, and I don't think that's how we want to apply it. So by striking restaurant, it essentially is a 500-foot spacing requirement between any form of a drive-through. With, again, the caveats that we put forth for less intensive uses or properties that can accommodate any potential backup or disruption on site without projecting that back into the roadway. Does that make sense?
And just so I'm clear, 500 feet, that number is there to prevent backup traffic or traffic snarls on a main roadway. Is
So
that correct?
well,
If
the
you-
500
if you
foot is
compact them.
between uses, right? So the idea is that drive-through restaurants are generally impactful uses. So by incorporating a spacing requirement, you can't have drive-through restaurant next to drive-through restaurant next to drive-through restaurant. So the idea is that they're spaced out, as opposed to being sort of, having a bunch of them next to each other, if that makes sense. So that was the idea there. So, all right, I'll keep moving on unless more questions at this point. So we're actually almost done. I don't have too much more. So we did strike in paragraph 4. We just related it back to such uses. Again, the idea of making the distinction restaurant versus coffee shop. We just wanted to keep it as use, so this would apply to either a drive-through restaurant or a drive-through coffee shop, as opposed to being able to maybe go out and say on a technicality that doesn't currently apply to a coffee shop. The next items, 5, 6, 7, 8, we added. These are essentially copy and paste items from another condition that you have in the ordinance. And these are actually really common requirements, but for some reason, they were not included with drive-through restaurant and drive-through coffee shop. They were identified, I think, to the permitted uses with accessory drive-throughs, if I'm not mistaken. So these are our existing conditions that we already have in the ordinance that we are now applying to these uses. So the first is simply making sure that the use does not have harmful effects on an adjacent residential district, which is pretty straightforward. I did try to not put that in there, and Kelly and Amy overrode me because I kind of felt like it's already a special land use, and we already have a general special land use standard about impacts off-site, but they felt like putting it in here still made sense and still gives the commission and/or board ultimately another way to evaluate these uses to make sure that they are harmonious. Clear identification between the drive-through lane and the parking lot. Again, very common requirement for other drive-throughs. The attempt here is to try to avoid on-site confusion, not to have motorists know that this is the lane I go to, or I'm not entering a drive-through lane unknowingly, and now I'm stuck in a drive-through lane when I just wanted to get around it and go to the parking lot. So just having clear delineation, I think, is pretty straightforward as well. The next one is the inclusion of an escape lane. So this is another item for drive-through uses. Escape lanes are very common. They are not always needed, I will tell you, in my experience. And so we do have, again, the use of, or the opportunity for discretion by the commission to not require the escape lane if it's not necessary. And then the last one, again, very common, and I don't think anybody's tried to cram a drive-through that wrapped around a front yet, not out here. I've seen it in other
Arby's.
communities. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, they've got.
It was there previously.
Yeah,
Arby's
yeah.
has it.
So the last one, again, this is an add-on, is that the drive-through lane and then ultimately the pickup window need to be on the side or rear building elevation, just so we don't have it wrapping around the front. And that's really an aesthetic thing as much as anything. But we felt like that was another good one to add to this particular set of standards since it was not included. Any questions on the rest of those items we went through before I jump into stacking and traffic studies?
Yeah, I have a few questions.
Please.
So I'll just go sequentially as you did there. Just want to make sure I'm interpreting this correctly. When we talk about 500 feet between lots, we're taking basically the closest point of each individual lot and measuring it, right? So it's from the property line, not distance between buildings? Is that accurate?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay,
I
and that's how we've
believe-
been measuring it?
Yes.
and- Okay.
I believe that's in the provision, so I don't know if it's, I don't think it's in a definition. It's in a provision somewhere that dictates how you measure spacing, and it would be property line to property line.
Okay.
Not building to building.
Yes.
I do appreciate in subsection 2, I think the additions there are warranted. 50 trips seems okay to me, frankly. And I'm going to go back to my previous life in engineering and doing over 100 Taco Bells in the Midwest. And I mean, that definitely seems appropriate here.
Not to cut you off, but do you agree that adding directional makes sense and is appropriate?
Mm-hmm. Whatever matches the new TIS standards the best, that language should match. So,
Perfect.
yep.
Thank you.
Number 5, I think this matches another part of the ordinance, right? It's also very subjective, which I think can be a benefit or a risk, frankly. But just looking at that, like the last part of that sentence, adjacent residential land uses such that it will not impact the use and enjoyment of said residential land use. One person's enjoyment is another person's burden, right?
Like Brian's like,
So, so it does make me a little uncomfortable,
okay.
you know, because, yeah. Oh, at the same time, if you recall from the last meeting, I would desire to simplify this ordinance and not complicate it. So at the absence of putting a whole bunch more subsections to that, to add to it, is there a buffer zone or something we can point to a little bit more directly? It's like, here's the standards for it, and we have a noise ordinance. So there are things in place in the ordinance. Is that most appropriate to point towards instead of just like a generalized statement like, don't bug your neighbors?
So what I'm gonna start, if Amy wants to stop me and or add to it, please do.
I'm trying to, sorry.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, think it through. So, I sort of mentioned the fact that I tried to not include that in my conversation with them, but Kelly and Amy always win, so I'm okay with that. I don't like to start arguments. Here's my thought.
You and me, Brian.
Yes,
We're not-
it is subjective. B, we already have, in our lighting regs, we have limitations for commercial lighting intensity at a residential property line. And in our landscaping regs, we have buffer zone requirements between commercial land uses and residential land uses. So I felt like between the special land use standard of basically not creating off-site impacts, and Kelly's probably watching on TV yelling at me, but I felt that we already have a protection there. Our landscaping requirements have specific provisions, objective, not subjective, as do our landscape provisions to protect this situation. So I feel like, I don't think it's needed. I do think it's redundant. That being said, we could potentially keep this in, and maybe along the lines of what I think you were suggesting, maybe we just specifically reference the special land use standard and the lighting
Buffer,
standard
lighting,
and the landscape standards.
noise ordinance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, can I?
Yep.
Sorry. My way of thinking was about that too, was that when you have a drive-through at the rear of a property, that's more intense lighting than you're gonna have a back of just a regular retail store or just a regular commercial building. And that's why I wanted it to be kept in, but I do see what you're saying about being subjective, and that is very hard. You know, when you're talking to the person who lives behind it, and, you know, you're looking at the plan, I
Yeah.
completely get that.
If I were code enforcement, I would want to be able to point towards some objective components to make a decision from.
Right.
So, just a thought. I do wonder if just adding another sentence or doing what Brian mentioned
Okay.
points it back to the components of the ordinance that are already in place.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, those will already be applied as part of this process. So
Yeah,
that's the other
totally.
part is every special land use has to also go through site plan review. And if we're gonna go through site plan review, landscaping and lighting regs are gonna be part of that process.
If I was an upset neighbor, I would look at that and I'd be like, ding, 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 right? So that, just a thought. Number 6, just make sure pavement striping is appropriate here. You're not talking about a separate curbed delineation.
I think
just-
it could be, striping, signage, it could be curbing
Okay.
if it's appropriate.
Yep.
It's not altogether uncommon for drive-through lanes and functioning drive aisles to be separated by a raised curb and or a landscape island, more preferably, not just a curb, but we would want to see an actual island. I think the island makes more sense. I don't know if we could add detail to that, if commission wanted. The one thing when you start doing things like that on a property, what you may hear back from the applicant developer side is that can start to mess with things like snow plowing.
Mhm.
Snow
Yeah, totally.
removal becomes, the more curbing, the more things that are hidden on that site, that becomes an issue for them.
Well, it messes with our next requirement of a bypass lane too, so.
Right.
The other thing is, more fast food restaurants, especially the most intense ones, have double drive-through lanes now. So I'm thinking through like, what's the greatest potential impact player out there for us right now? There's probably Chick-fil-A. Like they would draw a crowd in a double stacked drive-through and all, so like, probably not Krispy Kreme.
Oh, yeah.
Huh?
Yeah, they turn on their lights and
When they turn on the light, yeah. So thinking through that, I think this does capture a lot of really great components to grab onto to make sure that like, the safest possible outcome is provided for our community.
So I do have a question. I'm sorry, Eric.
You're good.
Before I forget this one. So my son, his apartment looks at a McDonald's drive-through. There's a brick wall that separates the McDonald's from where he can see when he walks out his front door. But the volume. Hi, welcome to McDonald's. I mean, that you can hear for, somebody had mentioned a noise ordinance. I don't know if it applies to like speaker, but if it's 3:00 in the morning and that's a 24-hour McDonald's, you're listening to French fries and hamburgers 24/7. And I don't know if the noise ordinance already in itself considers the wee hours of the morning, when people are trying to sleep.
It does.
Okay.
It is from 10 o'clock until, I believe, 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock. Sorry, I did not bring my computer with me. But it does, and it's 50 decibels. Is what
At
it
the
would
property
have.
line.
At the property line.
Yeah.
And
So
that's-
you still hear it, to be clear. So
Yeah.
50 decibels is like us talking in a library. So the reason that becomes a nuisance isn't because it doesn't, that style of noise doesn't blend into the background. Birds are chirping at 50 decibels, no one cares. But when you have this conversation about menu all day long,
And all night long.
and all night long, it becomes a nuisance regardless of the decibels. So,
I wouldn't be opposed to expanding that at some level, even if it's tied back to your noise ordinance or if there's some other provision. I will add, it is not at all uncommon, and I'm not gonna expect any of you to do any homework tonight if you don't want to. Anytime we've had a drive-through that I've reviewed that was adjacent to a residential property, as part of that general special land use review, I can
study.
almost guarantee you, I put in a request for information and details about the speaker setup to try to protect those residences. So again, the idea of like these general potential impacts that these uses can have, that is something that I have definitely brought up previously in this community and others, that I think we could either continue that as part of the special use review process or potentially refine that into something more specific as part of this amendment.
Brian, I'd be in favor of requiring, when adjacent to residential, a noise study.
Okay.
Because that brick wall doesn't help.
Nope.
Doesn't help at all. Can't see through it, but
And especially
that,
if you're on
that
the
sound's
second floor,
bouncing off of it.
When you're on the second
Yeah,
floor,
so
there's
it's literally
nothing.
the
You can watch
opposite.
everybody.
Yeah, it's the opposite impact that they desire. But things like trees and things like that can help dampen it. There are sound walls as well that can be a part of, you know, all that. But sound engineers would be the ones that would like design that and help understand the absorption capabilities. So.
I have a couple questions. Do we even have a drive-in restaurant?
We do not, but you know, if you think about Sonic,
Mhm.
their drive-ins,
A&W.
yeah, A&W, there's some more, there's still A&Ws that are out.
It's possible.
What's the other one? There's Sonic, there's another one. But yes,
Okay.
there are, I mean, there still exist.
So number 2 says the establishment of a new drive-through. Does that mean that any previous drive-throughs that are already in existence have to comply with that 500 feet? Or the establishment of a new drive-through, I'm just trying to figure out
So
what the specifics. Why is that there?
it would only be for the proposal. If there's an existing drive-through to drive-through that it does not meet your current standard, it would be considered non-conforming if they didn't have a variance to reduce that spacing. So the idea here, though, is to create a new one, again, throw aside these ideas, some caveats and some other things to waive that. Right now in your ordinance, if there was an existing drive-through, whether it met requirements or not, a new drive-through could not move in next door to it within that 500-foot space.
Okay.
It would not meet the standard. You could seek a variance for it, things like that. There's
Okay.
other alternatives, so I'm not saying that situation doesn't exist.
Okay.
But, yeah, as an existing, it could either be non-conforming, but if a new one wants to come in next to an established one, then it's the new one that has to comply. Ultimately, that does make them both non-compliant, but that's why, again, we tried to put in these provisions that give you all some discretion to maybe change that too.
Okay. And then, let me see. Down, drive-through windows shall be located on the side or the rear elevation. I mean, Bill was just kind of bringing up McDonald's in the rear, and I think, Eric, you kind of mentioned a few things that would prevent any hardships on surrounding properties, but I think we need some latitude in regards to what if you have a building that, I just worry about safety, right? Coming around the corner and boom, all of a sudden there's so many people lined up there that you're not seeing you're not anticipating that drive-through window is where it's positioned. Is that feasible, or that it would happen, or this would be on an end
I think of McDonald's as in the back.
or standalone? End or standalone?
It wouldn't matter. The idea here is that, I mean, it can only be on the side or rear, so essentially it can't be on the front.
Right, but I'm just,
The actual window.
right, where
The
you,
ordering station, though, can be anywhere in that.
Right, and I think that's where Brian was included with the marking. You know you're going into the drive-through
Right.
lane.
Right.
And you know that you're following that drive-through lane, and you're gonna
Right.
go around the corner.
okay.
What about a corner lot? Because I'm thinking about Tim Hortons at the gas station there at Grand Oaks Drive in Latson. I'm looking at it right now. Technically, that window is along Latson Road.
We could, because I just did a review a couple weeks ago in another community.
friends.
I think we do, in that community, I do have, I think the ordinance has discretion for corner lots. I think there's a provision specific for corner lots. I don't know that I can find it right now, but I think I'm gonna add a note here. I think that we could add a provision that would allow you to grant it I think the way it reads,
Could you do the non-required?
well, I think the way it was drafted, and again, it doesn't have to match here. We can write this how you guys want it. I'm just trying to give you an example. But I think in that other community, I think we allow it, something to the effect of commission may allow something to the effect of like the secondary front yard. So if you're a corner and they're both fronts, but this is clearly the main roadway and this is sort of the secondary roadway, then it could go in that front yard of the secondary roadway, but not the main roadway. I believe that's how it's written in elsewhere, but that doesn't have to work here.
Yeah. I mean, even in that instance, the current Tim Hortons wouldn't meet that standard.
Okay.
Because Latson is the primary roadway there. But its entry point is off of Grand Oaks Drive, which totally makes sense.
Yeah, I
right?
would say the
So,
front of that building is grand.
I think regardless, some accommodation for two frontages.
Yep.
Last question I have regarding number 7, it says, township may require inclusion of actual data for local or national chains and franchises in the study. So if you have an outside franchise that's not been established here and they're bringing something to request here, it might be a totally different, totally different kind of community where you're not even talking about the density of population and stuff. So is there something, and I know we have requested of applicants before for the traffic study to use the resources of different applicants that have come in, the hospital, the Healy's Homes, to contact those people that have done the traffic studies to include those. I don't know that the township can definitely steer them to say you need to use the same traffic study companies that the other people have already done, but is there some way that we can manage that? Because if this is going to open up the doors, I see that that would be a benefit, that they're having those same connections and references to use.
So I'm going to say a few things. So one, you jumped ahead on me a little bit. I didn't cover the stacking or the traffic study yet.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That's
Way
okay.
ahead.
Sorry.
So the second thing, I do want to cover these, but I want to try to, here's where I want to go with this pending us getting through these next two sections and getting your input. Again, I was able to chat with Shelby a little bit before the meeting. She did ask one of their transportation engineers to take just a quick peek at this, and that was where the directional idea came from initially. But she also said, and I won't put words in your mouth, but basically the ideas here are good in terms of trying to obtain actual factual data, especially for a place that is known to have maybe more traffic than what ITE would suggest. But I think what I want to do walking out of here tonight is I want Shelby to take this language back to her people and just have a quick review and maybe massage the language a little bit to make sure we're hitting the right points. This is a planner drafting a couple of paragraphs and sentences here that are really more engineering related. So I did my best, and I can explain my intent to you all, but I do think that there's probably a better way to explain what I was trying to get at. So I do want to make that a point too. So when we leave here tonight, that's one of the things that we intend to do moving forward is I've already made a couple of changes. I've got a couple of notes to tweak some things, make them more explicitly objective. But then I want to get actual engineering response to these couple of sentences related under the stacking of the traffic study too.
Does a traffic study have a lifespan? Can I use data from a traffic study completed 20 years ago? Does that count?
No, and I'll defer to Shelby if you want specifics, but there's a whole, this 180709, this is just a small excerpt of that entire section. It's pages and pages long of requirements of what has to be included in a traffic study, and it definitely is time-sensitive data. You have to use, it's within, is it
That's
3
2
years,
years.
2 years?
Yeah, it's not just yours, it's like if, like 50 or more trips get added, then you have to redo it also. Like if you have a PUD and more things come in. So you guys have secrets for that.
Thank you.
So that being said, real quick, Mr. Chair, I just want to make sure, I think we're kind of on the same page here, but I do want to just briefly explain where I was coming from with these last two paragraphs. So the first was, again, an attempt to provide some discretion as it relates to stacking spaces. So right now, your stacking spaces in the ordinance are required as part of the parking table. So if you go and you look up the parking requirement for a particular use, if stacking is also required, it's listed within that item. What I wanted to do was provide an opportunity, and I will say that for drive-through coffee shop, drive-through restaurants, the standard here in many places is simply 10 stacks. That's common. But as we were talking about before, there are certainly franchises that necessitate more than 10. They can't function on 10. And so my intent here was to give you all the ability to require more, essentially, if they weren't already proposing it. Now, my mind kind of believes or wants to believe that if one of those franchises came in the community, they know what they need to function and operate. They're probably not going to come in with 10 stacks if they need 20. That's generally the way it would work. But that being said, I don't want to risk that. I want to make sure that it's going to work. So the idea here was that you all could either increase or decrease as needed. So it could also be a business with very little trip generation, small store, mom and pop, not major franchise, something like that. Maybe they don't need 10 full stacking spaces. Maybe they can get away with less. So the idea here was to give you the ability to either require more or to require fewer stacking spaces than would otherwise be required based on data. And the idea was, again, as part of a traffic study of actual usage, be it something that was provided as part of the review process or be it something that we collected. I put in this one something that could be collected by township staff. So it could even be evaluated. We could go into Brighton for a similar use and simply observe peak hour stacking usage and requirements and see if that makes sense to apply. But again, I will go back to what I said earlier. I do want to make sure that Shelby has her folks give that a quick read to make sure that that makes sense and that in a transportation engineer were to read that sentence, that they can make sense of that. Which hopefully they can. But I think it probably needs a little massaging. And then the same goes for the last section under this draft, which was the idea, not related to the stacking, but specifically for a traffic study that was required with a new project to use actual trip generation data as opposed to just defaulting to ITE. And my thought process here was, what ends up kind of happening, Eric's used them in the past. I don't know that anyone else, if you've ever seen the ITE manuals, I mean, they're books and books and books.